Welcome. Today we're going to talk about finding the actual confidence interval when you do not know your population mean. So yesterday we talked about finding the t-score when we have the population and we have our confidence interval. So today, this is very similar to that formula that we were doing right before we left school, where we have our mean, we subtract our margin of error, and this is going to give us our confidence interval. So I have labeled in here what all these symbols mean in case you forgot. So this is your sample mean, because now we're just talking about samples. This is that t-score that you're going to look up. This is your standard deviation of the sample that you're told. And then your n, of course, is your sample size. So the steps in finding the confidence interval, first thing you have to find your margin of error. So that's your t-score. You multiply it to your standard deviation divided by the square root of the sample. And then you're going to take that margin of error and you add it and you subtract it to your sample mean. So we're going to try a couple of examples of these. So right now we have a random sample of high temperatures for 12 record Thanksgiving days, has an average of 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Assume the variable is normally distributed, so we always have to know that, and the standard deviation of the sample temp was 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Find the 95% confidence interval of the population mean for the temperature. So first thing we got to do is we need to look up our t-score. So our t-score, we first have to do our degrees of freedom. So because it tells us that our sample size it didn't. Oh, did I miss that? Oh, yeah. Our sample size here was 12. So that means our degrees of freedom are 11. And then we want the 95% confidence interval. So we're going to look up the 11 at 95% confidence. So I have this table here again. Here's the 95% confidence. And we're going to go over to the 11, which would give us the 2.201. So we're going to go ahead and write that down. Oops. 2.201. So we're now going to use that margin of error formula where we want to take this 2.201. We're going to multiply it to our standard deviation, which it said was, I believe, 8. And divide it by the square root of our sample size, which was 12. So we're not going to use the 11 of our degrees of freedom. We're going to use the 12. When we put this in the calculator, you should end up with 5.08. So remember, we're going to go 2 numbers past the decimal on that one. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take our mean, which it said our mean was 42. And then we're going to subtract that margin of error. And then it's less than the population mean, which is less than, again, 42. Now plus the 5.08. And so when we put this in the calculator, we get a 36.92 is less than the mean, is less than 47.08. So this is going to be my confidence interval. Then from there, so our next example says the data represents a random sample of the number of home fires started by candles for the past several years. Find the 99% confidence interval for the mean number of home fires started by candles each year. So this time it gives us the raw data. So before you can find your t-score, you need to go through and remember how we would type this in Google Sheets? We need to find the mean, so our sample mean. And then we need to find our sample standard deviation. So make sure and type that in your Google Sheets. When we type this in, our sample mean ends up being 7,041.4. And then the standard deviation ends up being 1,610.3. The other thing we need to know is our sample size. Please remember, it didn't tell us the sample size, but we are expected to count how many raw data we have. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that means that our N equals 7. So we're getting all that data from these numbers here. Now we just go ahead and find our t-score. So since our N is 7, and we need a 99% confidence interval, we're going to go back over to this table. And then we're going to look at the 7 and go over to the 99% confidence interval. And we have a 3.499. Oh, sorry, not at the 7, at the 6, because we got to subtract 1. So it'd be 3.707. So we're going to go over here, and we're going to use the t-score of that 3.707. So we're going to go ahead and find our margin of error. So that's the 3.707 times our standard deviation, which was 1,610.3, over the square root of our sample size, which was 7. When we put this in the calculator, we get 2,256.2. Then from there, we need to add it and subtract it to our sample mean. So our sample mean was 7,041.4. So we're going to subtract that 2,256.2, which is less than the mean, is less than the 7,041.4 plus the 2,256.2. And then when we put that in the calculator, we get 4,785.2 is less than the mean, is less than 9,297.6. And that would be your confidence interval.